What's up everybody, and welcome to another episode of China Update, where I try and help you guys keep on top of the world's #2 economy. My name is Tony. For those of you watching for the first time, I work in China in an executive role, and I put these videos together for my friends back home, and they said you should throw that stuff up on YouTube, and that's what I do now. So if you are interested in following that sort of material, that sort of content, maybe consider subscribing. For everyone else, as always, it's good to see you. Fortunately, last weekend I did not have to evacuate. It seems that the river did not break its banks. Thankfully, floods are ongoing. However, one of the rivers that is at its highest capacity at the moment is a river about 10 minutes walk from where I am. Before we jump into the big deep dive stories, we're going to have several mini updates at the front of the episode before we jump into some of the main stuff like Hong Kong and the US policy change in the South China Sea and China's reaction to that this week. If you enjoy the content as a new YouTuber, it is a massive help if you smash that like button. It tells the algorithm that this is legitimate content, which is particularly useful because the algorithm does not like people using VPNs, and because I'm in China, I have to throw it up on a VPN. But anyway, let's look at the mini updates and then look at the main stories this week on China Update. Okay, first up, let's start with the economy. On Thursday, Chinese officials said that the Chinese economy expanded 3.2% from April through June compared with the same period last year. You guys know, of course, that the official number is not particularly important, but there are a couple of other data sets we can look at. The data that was released showed that investment from state-owned enterprises increased during this period, but investment from the private sector decreased by about 7%. Interestingly, this piece of information was omitted from the English version and was only in the Chinese version that was published by the National Bureau of Statistics this week. One other piece of data worth looking at from this week's release is that youth unemployment in China rose to a new high of 19.3%. The New York Times reports this week that the Trump administration is considering a visa ban on all 92 million members of the Chinese Communist Party and their families. Now, this would be a massive deal if it did in fact happen, but at this time it hasn't been truly confirmed, and we don't even know whether the Trump administration would go forward with it. If it does look like it's going to happen, or if it does happen early next week, there will be a long deep dive looking at its ramifications for the relationship and the world in next week's episode. On this topic of visa restrictions, also with the US, on Wednesday, the State Department announced that the US was imposing visa restrictions on, quote, certain employees of Chinese technology companies that abuse human rights, end quote. And in the statement, they named the telecommunications company Huawei by name. The worst flooding in decades continues, with over 60 million people across the country affected. Hundreds of people have died or are missing already, and over 40,000 houses have collapsed. Warning levels have been extended to over 400 rivers, including the one near me, like I said before. Dams and similar infrastructure has been put to the test. An average precipitation in the Yangtze River Basin since June is the highest that it has been since 1961. China on Monday warned about the outbreak of a highly contagious foot and mouth disease among pigs in the southern province of Guangdong. This could actually be a big deal. It's not really seeing much news time, but I'm going to be keeping an eye on it. If it does look like it's going to break out in the world's largest producer and consumer of pork, we will probably have a full update on this episode in the future. And last of the mini updates this week, Western press is reporting on a leaked 18-page draft agreement document to greatly increase cooperation across the board between China and Iran. The draft envisions Chinese-built, quote, airports, high-speed rails, and subways, as well as, quote, free trade zones, end quote, in several regions of Iran. According to the leaked draft, projects total almost $500 billion over 25 years. The document also describes deepening military cooperation. Again, at this point, we only have leaked documents in the US media, and so we cannot confirm anything. Like I said, if we have greater detail and more statements coming from some of these state parties, we can discuss this and its ramifications for China's operations in the Middle East in a future episode. Okay, so let's jump into the main stories with some deep dive topics. The first, of course, has to be Hong Kong. So opposition pan-democratic lawmakers held primaries over the weekend for the upcoming LegCo elections in the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region. Co-organizer Benny Tai told reporters after the polls closed that they recorded over 590,000 ballots and more than 20,000 paper ballots, smashing the 170,000 expected. The successful and popular primaries, however, seem to have spooked the authorities, with strong denunciations coming from the mainland betraying their concern. Let's look at some of the narratives that are being pushed from the mainland after these primaries were held over the weekend. On Monday, state-run media Xinhua wrote, quote, severely jeopardize the electoral process and cause unfairness, violate the prohibition on group gathering amid the COVID-19 epidemic, and lack protection of personal data, end quote. The following day, the chief executive of the Special Minister of Region, Carrie Lam, weighed in saying, quote, if this so-called primary election's purpose is to achieve the ultimate goal of delivering what they call a 35 plus, with the objective of objecting to and resisting every policy initiative of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region government, then it may fall into the category of subverting the state power, which is now one of the 4 types of offences under the new national security law. End quote. That day, a spokesperson of the Hong Kong and Macau Affairs Office with the State Council said that the, quote, primaries sought to hijack public opinion, end quote, and ironically claimed that the primaries, quote, harmed the democratic electoral system in Hong Kong, end quote. A spokesperson for Beijing's liaison office in Hong Kong also weighed in saying, quote, the goal of organizer Benny Tai and the opposition camp is to seize the ruling power of Hong Kong and carry out a Hong Kong version of color revolution, end quote. On Tuesday, the United States State Department said in a statement, quote, we note with grave concern Hong Kong Chief Executive Carrie Lam's threat that this primary may have violated Beijing's new, quote-unquote, national security law for the territory, once again demonstrating the Chinese Communist Party's fear of democracy and its own people's free thinking, end quote. The Legislative Council elections in Hong Kong will be held on September 6th. The state-run Global Times ran a piece this week about the head of Hong Kong's Correctional Services Department saying that a large number of young people are expected to be put in correctional institutions in the future, and that they will, quote, expand manpower and strengthen civic education for them, end quote. Now let's look at a couple of international reactions again this week to developments in the SAR. This week, several EU diplomats expressed that there is broad support within the EU member states for some action regarding Hong Kong, but that tough measures were not being discussed in detail because of resistance from close trade partners of China in Europe, such as Greece and Hungary. On Wednesday, US President Donald Trump signed the Hong Kong Autonomy Act that may lead to sanctions, among other things, and an executive order that will have the US treat Hong Kong as it currently treats the wider People's Republic of China. In quite a U-turn, the UK announced on Tuesday that buying new Huawei 5G equipment will be banned from the 31st of December 2020 and be completely removed from UK 5G networks by the year 2027. Digital Secretary Oliver Dowland said in a statement to the House of Commons, quote, by the time of the next election, we will have implemented in law an irreversible path for the complete removal of Huawei equipment from our 5G networks, end quote. In response, the Chinese People's Daily Overseas Edition and other state-run publications repeated its line that European countries must not exclude Huawei from their 5G supplies list, otherwise they will be seen by Beijing as quote-unquote hostile powers, and they will be responsible for the consequences. Again, very interesting considering that the official position is that Huawei is a private company and connected to the government in the mainland, and that the Chinese themselves in the past have banned technology companies for national security reasons. The decision to exclude Huawei from UK's infrastructure systems will likely further strain the UK-China relationship and may well lead to economic sanctions against the UK like we've seen in Australia over the last few months. You may see in some Western pressure this narrative or this idea that the UK decision represents the government in the UK giving in to US pressure. I would strongly push back against this argument. The US conducted a huge pressure campaign against many of its allies last year, including the United Kingdom, and the United Kingdom then did not budge. I think the most salient change over the last 6 months, however, has been Chinese state behavior itself, from actions in Hong Kong, actions around the pandemic, and a general more assertive or even aggressive diplomatic stance, which has led to changes in popular and elite opinion in the United Kingdom. The UK decision leaves Canada as the last of the Five Eyes intelligence members to have not blocked Huawei on security grounds, increasing pressure on Ottawa to make a call regarding the company. This week, two new government guidelines coming out of Italy imposes new security protocols that may make it very difficult for Huawei to operate there. While we are on the UK and on Huawei, it's worth touching on a small scandal regarding Jesus College, Cambridge, and Chinese government funding. Earlier this year, the university's UK-China Global Issues Dialogue Centre published a report about telecommunications reforms which took positions favourable to Huawei. It was revealed last week through a Freedom of Information Act request and disclosures that Jesus College had accepted £200,000 for the Dialogue Centre from a branch of the Chinese State Council, £55,000 from another branch for the China Centre, and £150,000 from Huawei itself for the telecommunications report. In what I think is a very serious and consequential step, on Monday, the United States changed its official position on the South China Sea. Before this, the US policy had been to insist that maritime disputes between China and its smaller neighbors be resolved peacefully through United Nations-backed arbitration, while not taking an official side. The new US position is far more assertive than in the past, and it flat out rejects specific Chinese claims for the first time. Quote, "The PRC has no legal grounds to unilaterally impose its will on the region. Beijing has offered no coherent legal basis for its, quote, 9-dash line, end quote, claim in the South China Sea since formally announcing it in 2009. In a unanimous decision on July 12, 2006, an arbitral tribunal constituted under the 1982 Law of the Sea Convention, to which the PRC is a state party, rejected the PRC's maritime claims as having no basis in international law. The world will not allow Beijing to treat the South China Sea as its maritime empire. America stands with our Southeast Asian allies and partners in protecting their sovereign rights to offshore resources consistent with their rights and obligations under international law." End quote. The US Assistant Secretary of East Asia and Pacific Affairs, David Stilwell, gave a speech and spoke to media the following day, providing more details on this official position, what it means, and indicated that sanctions may be a tool used, saying, quote, "We're no longer going to say that we are neutral on these maritime issues. When a Chinese drilling rig plants itself in Vietnamese or Malaysian waters, we're going to be able to make a positive statement," end quote. Interestingly, on the mainland, it took a few days for the Chinese side to respond with its typical government statement and state media commentary. This normally indicates that the political system has been taken by surprise somewhat and that the relevant bodies are processing how to best respond. The initial statement was a boilerplate-like statement that was released by the foreign ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijian, who said, quote, "The US as a country outside the region wishes nothing but chaos in the South China Sea so that it can gain from the muddied waters. We strongly deplore and firmly oppose the wrong move by the US and urge it to stop stirring up trouble on the South China Sea issue and stop continuing down the wrong path," end quote. On Tuesday, speaking to his counterpart in the Philippines, Foreign Minister Wang Yi said, quote, "Dealing with the South China Sea issue requires us to look forward together instead of going back to the past. And that, quote, contentious maritime issues are not the sum total of the Philippines-China bilateral relationship," end quote. The language again suggesting that the US foreign policy change on Monday took the foreign policy apparatus in Beijing by surprise. Now, while we are on the subject of China's behavior in the South China Sea, it is worth touching on statements coming out of Japan. On Tuesday, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's government approved a white paper which held, among other things, China was, quote, "continuing to attempt to alter the status quo in the East China Sea and the South China Sea," end quote, and with spreading disinformation. Let's finish up this week by having a look at the developments with the diplomatic spat between China and Australia. So Australia joined several nations, including Canada and the UK, in suspending its extradition treaty with the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region and offering an immigration pathway for residents fleeing the city, which was announced by Prime Minister Morrison last Thursday. The Chinese embassy in Canberra was not very happy, saying China, quote, "strongly deplores and opposes the groundless accusations and measures announced by the Australian government," and went on to say, its hypocrisy and double standards is exposed in full, end quote. The embassy spokesperson called on Australia to, quote, immediately stop meddling in Hong Kong affairs and China's internal affairs under any pretext or in any way. Otherwise, it will lead to nothing but lifting a rock only to hit one's feet, end quote. This is an expression in Mandarin. It means something along the lines of shooting oneself in the foot. Now, China has been in the dog box, so to speak, for over a month now, facing economic punishment from its largest trading partner. But it looks like the damage may not be too bad overall. Data this week shows that while Australian exports of things like beef and barley have indeed dropped due to a surge in commodities like iron ore and coal to Chinese buyers, overall Australian exports to China have remained relatively stable. The commodities surge tells us two things. One, the market is anticipating a building boom in China, and two, while China can source things like beef and higher education from elsewhere, commodities are another story. Approximately 60% of Chinese iron ore imports and 30% of its coal come from Australia. These are key inputs for construction in China, a key driver for growth. Okay guys, that's our episode for this week. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments below what you thought, if you agree or disagree with some of the analysis, and if there's anything you think I should have touched on more. Also, let me know what you think about this new format where I put the mini stories at the beginning and then I have the deeper dive, the bigger subjects at the end of the episode. As always though, stay safe and stay sane wherever you are, and I will see you all next time on China Update.